Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are back with day number 1 of the World Blitz Chess Championship being held in Doha, Qatar. Now, yesterday, Magnus won the rapid portion, but today the event continues with the Blitz. And in this Blitz tournament, there are many strong players playing, but one of the recurring themes that I've noticed is the overperformance, in a sense, of a lot of the young kids. Now, one of those players who needs no introduction is, of course, the 12-year-old, soon-to-be Grandmaster from Argentina, Faustino Oro. Now, in the first round of the Blitz, we have Faustino at the young age of 12 playing against one of the modern legends of the game, the 43-year-old Levon Aronian. Now, before we get into this game, I do want to state just how unique chess is from the standpoint that chess might be the only sport or game where people who are as young as Faustino is will be competing with experienced veterans. So without further ado, let's jump into this matchup. We have Levon versus Faustino in round number 1 of the Blitz. So Levon opens with the move e4, Faustino plays c5, we get knight to f3, and now we get the move d6. Levon plays bishop c4 here. Of course, one thing I mentioned yesterday in my recap when I covered the game between Magnus and Cengiz Khan Erdogmas from Turkey is that oftentimes you want to avoid big tactical skirmishes. So Levon, by playing bishop c4, is trying to avoid the heavy theory and the tactics of the Najdorf defense. So we get bishop to c4. Faustino plays knight to f6. We get the move d3, and now we have the move knight c6. Levon castles. We get e6. A lot of standard developing moves here. We get castles, rook e1, a6, c3, queen c7, and now we get the move bishop b3. Here, Faustino plays bishop d7. Levon goes knight to f1. We get b5, and here we get the move knight to g3. Now, all of this so far is pretty standard. You'll notice that the computer gives black a very tiny advantage, but there's a lot to play for in the center here for both sides. White wants to play d4. Black maybe wants to play d5 or try to play on the b file. So it's a very flexible setup for both the players. So here we get the move rook fc8. Levon plays h3. We get rook b8, and now we have the move takes and bishop to f4. Here we got the move b4, and as you'll notice from the valuation bar, this is the first fairly serious mistake in the game. Computer actually wants black to play c4, but keep in mind this is a blitz game. You don't have all the time in the world to think, and generally you want to move within a couple of seconds. So if you don't see the idea right off and you sort of have other thoughts or other intuitions, this move b4 makes a lot of sense to try and open up the b file. This also is very much in line with the classic themes because there are many different Sicilians where you want to play for b4 to open up the file. Oftentimes you'll have a fianchetto bishop on g7, but this idea of b4 to open up the queen side is very standard, so it makes a lot of sense why Faustino played it. So now we get the move bishop c4. Here we get rook to a8, Levon trades, and now we get the move pawn to d4. Here we get the trade, we get takes, and now we get the move knight to b4. Now in this position, white has a little bit more space in the center with this big white center, the pawns on e4 and d4, but black is also very solid, and we also have all these pawns on the same files here with the symmetrical pawn structure, or not symmetrical, I should say all the pawns on the same files is 5v5. It should be about equal. So Levon plays the move queen b3. We get rook to b8 here, simply guarding this knight on b4, and now we get the move rook c1. Here we get queen to a7, and in this position, Levon plays move queen d1. We get rook c8, and now we get the move bishop f1. Now, it's very clear that this entire game has been a resounding success for Faustino Oro up to this point because he is even on time, he is even on the board, and one of the biggest advantages that kids are going to have when you play someone who's older is that your brain processes a lot quicker, especially when you're in these bullet scrambles. So at this point, I would say the advantage is in Faustino's favor. So we get the trade. Now we get queen to b7, trying to attack this pawn on e4. We get queen b2, and now we get the move pawn to h6, simply creating space for the king to avoid the classic ice skater checkmate. Levon plays bishop d2. We get d5 here, trying to guard the knight from being captured. And now we get the move e5, knight to e4. And here Levon plays the move bishop e1. Now we get the trade, we get bishop to c6 here. There's a very nice thematic move. It's not the best move according to the computer, but the problem here for black is that this knight is pinned. If you ever move the knight, you'll do a Botez gambit and resign the game. And when you go bishop c6, you simply want to move the knight away with your bishop guarding the queen. So we get g4. Faustino plays bishop b5 here. I don't know if Faustino suddenly changed his mind or realized that he had missed bishop b5 initially when he went bishop c6, but he decides to audible and play this move. Now, luckily for Faustino, this is a situation where this move is completely fine, even though maybe it would have been a little bit better right away. So we get bishop takes bishop, queen takes. Now we get the move king to h2, and here Faustino plays the move queen c4. Now at this point, Faustino is starting to take over the game, as I would like to say, because both players are very low on time, but White's pawns here on d4 and e5 are potentially much bigger targets than any weaknesses Black has. So Levon decides to trade the bishop. Now we get queen to f2, bishop to c3 here, and you'll notice that this knight is really glued to these two pawns. It must stay here in order for the bishop not to capture the pawns. So you got queen to e3. Computer actually prefers to move g5 here. Levon plays queen e3. Obviously, he's worried about this move queen to d3 here. Queen has some scope on the diagonal, still massive pressure on the pawn on d4. So that's why he goes queen e3. Here, Faustino plays bishop b2. We get queen d2, bishop c1. We got the move queen to f2. And this move is effectively the losing blunder. Now, what Levon should have played here was this move queen to e1, and it's a very important point that if you play queen to e1, the first thing is that Black can't bring the queen in because you hang the bishop, and so you're basically stuck here trying to figure out what to do with this bishop on c1. Now, if you go bishop to f4 here, which is the natural move, after king to g1 and queen to d3 here, White has this very important move, king to f2, and here all these squares are covered so the bishop can't infiltrate, and apparently White is still holding. But with only seconds left on the clock in this bullet situation, it's very understandable that Levon plays queen f2 instead. And now after the move queen to d3, with the bishop having access to both of these squares, White is actually losing. So Levon goes queen a2, we get bishop to f4, king g1, bishop to e3 check, king h2, and now we get the move bishop takes d4. Now, of course, you'll notice the computer says that queen to f1 would win on the spot, but this is a bullet spot, not going to be critical of the player's moves here. Bishop takes d4 is the most natural human reaction. So you get queen to a8. Here Faustino plays king h7, and now we get the move queen to f8. Faustino plays queen e3, another excellent move to grab the pawn on e5. We get the capture, we get the trade, and now we get queen e1 check, and here we get the move queen to d3. Now, I don't know if queen to d3 is necessarily the absolute best way to play this. If I were playing this position, most likely I would have played the move d4 to push the d pawn, but what Faustino decides here is that he wants to try and potentially push either the d or the e pawn. So Levon plays queen c6, we get queen f1, now we get queen to f4. One of the reasons these last couple moves have happened with all the checks is that Faustino is trying to gain time on the clock before playing a concrete plan. So we get check, queen e4, queen c6, we get this, now we get queen f6, king h2, and here Faustino finally decides that it's time to start pushing his p in the middle of the board. Levon plays queen c6, we get queen to f4, now we get e5 here, and with these two connected passed pawns, it is all but over for Levon Aronian. Levon plays queen d5, we get queen to e3 here, nice move escorting the pawns. We get queen e6, check, queen f4, and now we get the move d3, no check on f5, queen supports the pawn thrust. Levon plays queen b3, we get e4, and in this position, Levon Aronian resigns the game with the white pieces against Faustino Oro here. Faustino is simply pushing his p with these two pawns, and it's a very, very easy win. Now, this really shows how strong kids have become these days, because there aren't really any major mistakes at all in this game from Levon, other than one inaccuracy when he didn't put his king on g1 and f2 with his queen e1 maneuver. But Levon effectively got flat outplayed by Faustino in this game, and that is just amazing. When you think about how young Faustino is, you compare that against the experience that Levon Aronian has being a top player for well over 2 decades now, it just shows how the game of chess is changing. We already saw it in the rapid, but we're also seeing it here in the blitz as well. Now, before we move on to the next game, or we'll move on to the next game anyway, we have the reigning world champion Gukesh Fabiano playing against Grandmaster Hans Niemann. Now, Hans had a very, very good performance in the rapid, tying for second place and finishing 4th on tiebreaks, but he's hoping to perform even better in the blitz, where he actually came very close to winning last year. Now, in this matchup, both the players are struggling. They're in the middle of the pack as they go into this classic matchup, and Gukesh has the white pieces. So Gukesh plays e4. Hans plays c5, we get knight to f3, and now we get the move knight c6. Now, one thing you might be wondering in these recaps, or even if you're following the tournament, is we are seeing a lot of Sicilians, much more than we're seeing the classic king pawn openings with pawn to e4, pawn to e5. And my biggest view on that is the reason this is occurring is that players are taking massive risks. They want decisive games. They don't want to play solid positional chess. And it makes sense, because in this format with 19 rounds and then a knockout, you need to rack up the wins when possible. So we get the Sicilian bishop b5 here. This is what is known as the classic Rossolimo attack. We get g6 from Hans, Gukesh castles, all pretty standard, and now we get the move e5. Here we get the trade from Gukesh. We get to move a4. Hans plays queen e7, and now we get to move pawn to a5. Hans plays knight f6. Gukesh goes d3, castles h3 here. h3 is a move designed to stop black from playing bishop to g4, and now we get to move knight e8. Here Gukesh plays knight d2, Hans goes knight c7, and now we get to move knight to c4, where these knights pressure the pawn in the center. Worth noting here that black would love to play b5 and kick the knight out of town, but b5 here would simply lose the game because of the classic end peasant maneuver with pawn takes pawn. Actually, lose the game is too strong, but white is much better. That's also the reason Gukesh pushed this pawn all the way up the board at the start of the game. So we get f6 from Hans. Here Gukesh plays bishop to e3, and now we get the move knight to e6. Gukesh plays c3, and Hans plays the move rook d8. Now we get queen c2, Hans plays rook b8, and here we get the move b4. Now, what's really amazing about this game, in my view, is that this is just a straight up theoretical battle. In Blitz, you don't generally see such battles. Players try to play things that are a little bit offbeat, a little bit less known, but both players here are playing their go-to in this Rosslimo attack. It's clear that Gukesh is playing his best prep, and Hans is playing his main line as well. But as we see, this move rook to b8 is a big mistake because after b4 here, white creates massive pressure on this diagonal with the bishop, and black is in a world of hurt. So, after we get the move b4, Hans plays the move b5. This is a mistake here. Computer wants rook to a8 back. Frankly, it's a very inhuman move for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very weird to just move a rook back to the corner of the board where it does nothing. Second reason is that after this trade, there are threats like queen to a2 here. If you were to play king h8, I think there might be d4 here. It looks very dangerous and hard to play. So Hans plays b5, trying to be aggressive. We get the classic end peasant maneuver. We get pawn takes pawn. And here Hans blunders with knight takes c5. Now what Hans should have played here is taken with a pawn, doubling his pawns up here. And the main reason for this is that it prevents white from building this classic big white center and exploding the board. But Hans decides to take with a knight. Worth noting that Hans here is moving a little bit too fast. In fact, both players are moving very quickly here. But after this move d4, as you can tell from the evaluation bar, white is completely winning. And the reason here is that after the trade, black is unable to take this pawn on e4. If black were to capture with the knight here, white can go bishop to f4. Now the knight is under attack and the rook is under attack. White is going to win material and the game. And if black were to take with a queen here, after queen takes e4, it's the same thing. White trades the queens, goes bishop to f4, knight and the rook are both under attack at the same time, and white will win the game. So that is why Hans plays knight to e6, and now we get d5, the perfect move from Gukesh here, further thrusting in the center of the board. He opens up this diagonal, more threats towards the pawn and the knight. Rook on e1 also perfectly placed if this e-file should ever open up. Hans decides to trade. He goes rook takes pawn, and now we get to move bishop to f4. Now, all the moves that Gukesh is playing in this game are the absolute top computer moves, and this shows just how strong Gukesh is, contrary to what people will say. If the plans are there, even if he's low on time in a blitz game or rapid, for example, he is incredibly dangerous to face. So after bishop f4, Hans plays rook b7. We get the move knight to d6 here. Now the bishop and the rook are under attack. This rook on e1 is perfectly placed as well, and all of black's pieces are going to drop. So we get rook c5 here from Hans. Computer wants queen c7, but this move is losing for a multitude of reasons. Probably the cleanest one is simply to trade and play knight takes bishop in a blitz game at least. Here black will take the bishop, and after knight to e7, white forks the rook and the king at the same time. After the trade here, white has the two towers coming up the board, maybe even a double kebab on the 7th, and the game will end in a victory for white. So Hans goes rook c5. Now Gukesh plays queen to b3, pinning this knight on e6. Now the rook, the bishop, and the knight are all massive targets. Hans plays g5, and here we get the move bishop to g3. Hans plays rook c7, and now Gukesh simply takes the bishop on c8, takes the knight on e6, and after queen to f7, he ends with the stylish finish, rook to a7, sacking the rook, and here Hans Niemann resigns the game. Now, the reason that Hans resigns here is that if Hans were to grab the free rook with queen takes rook, there's rook to e7 here, creating what we call the classic fossil. The queen checks the king, rook hits the queen, you move the rook, I take the queen, I have an extra queen, extra knight, I will win very, very soon. If you were to play, actually you can't even go rook c7 because I will just, if rook c7, I will simply trade everything off. Now I win the rook, and after takes, we get the double checkmate with rook to e8 ending the game immediately. So there's really nothing black can do. If you were to move the queen anywhere else, I don't know, queen h5, rook to e8 is still checkmate here. If you go queen to f8, there's rook to e8, check, winning the queen as well. So there's just nothing that black can do. So Gukesh wins this game, and this is just a classic beating. Gukesh plays a more or less perfect game against Hans. Not really unclear where Hans went wrong, whether it was a preparation issue or what was going on, but Gukesh shows that he really understands the structure and the play in this Ross Lima extremely well. Hans never had a chance in this game, despite probably being the better blitz player on paper, and Gukesh does show why he is the current world champion. So Gukesh would win this game. Both he and Hans are in the middle of the field. They're not contending up towards the top just yet, but we have a full day tomorrow to see what happens. So the last game we're going to be covering is, of course, featuring Fabiano Caruana, the current world number 3, against Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion. Now you're probably wondering, why haven't we been covering Magnus games? Now, Magnus actually has had an interesting day. He got off to a relatively good start. In the middle, he had a crazy loss against Arjun Erigaisi, where he tried to make a move. His queen fell off the board. He slammed the table. So there's perhaps a little bit more drama. But nonetheless, he has recovered since this loss in the middle to Arjun. And as we cover this 12th round game between Fabiano and Magnus, Fabiano is currently leading the tournament with 8.5 points out of 11. But Magnus, despite not playing his best, is only a half point behind with 8 points. So Fabiano opens with e4 here. After e4, Magnus plays d6. We get d4, knight to f6, and now we get to move knight c3. Magnus goes e5, and here we get what is known as the classic Philidor defense. Now, in the recent clutch chess event held about 2 months ago in St. Louis, Missouri, Magnus played the system to great effect. He beat both Gukesh and myself in the Philidor. I'm not sure if he beat Fabi, but he definitely beat 2 of the other 3 players. So after knight bd7, Fabi plays bishop to c4, bishop to e7, castles, and now we get to move a4. Magnus plays c6, and here we get to move a5. Magnus goes queen c7, and here we get to move rook to e1. Now, all of this so far is pretty standard, nothing super crazy. Magnus plays h6, we get h3, and here we get to move rook to e8. Now, in this position, Fabiano decides to play this move d5, and it's a very, very peculiar choice, because to me, when I look at this position, it looks like both the players are moving relatively quickly. They know what's going on, and they're still in their preparation. Now, this move is actually a serious inaccuracy with pawn to d5, after which black is, in fact, better. What Fabi should have played was either the move bishop to e3 here. Also note, the knight can't jump to g4, so his bishop is great on e3, no way to harass the bishop, or the move bishop to f1, preparing to play d5. But Fabi moves quickly. He plays the move d5, and now Magnus is able to lash out with this move pawn to b5. Now, prior to d5, say white were to play bishop b3, black would never play b5, because after the trade, black has this weak pawn on the a file here, and after a move like bishop to e3, white is simply a little bit better. So here we get to move d5 instead from Fabi. Magnus plays b5, we get the trade, and now the big difference here is that black is going to be able to take the pawn on d5. So here we get bishop to b3, Magnus decides to take on d5, we get pawn takes, and here we get to move bishop to d7. Now, in this position, Fabi plays the move rook to a6 here. And in this, it is worth noting that Magnus probably should have tried to play a5 here, because after bishop d7 and rook to a6, this rook is permanently targeting the pawn and the knight, and this pawn can't really move forward, and black has to worry about guarding it at all times. So Magnus plays rook c8. Fabi goes queen d3, we get queen b7, rook to a5, and now we get to move bishop to e8, and here, bishop to d8 I should say, and here Fabiano plays queen to a6. Magnus trades the queens, and now plays the move knight to e8. Now, after this move knight to e8 is played in this position, it looks like black is starting to unwind. The knights are coming to the queen side. Magnus, of course, being the great endgame player that he is, you expect him to find a way to win this game. So here we get to move bishop to e3. Magnus plays knight to c4, we get the trade, and here Fabiano makes a serious error with the move knight to d2. Now, the computer wanted Fabi to play the move rook to a1, trying to pressure this pawn on a7 here. After this move rook to a1, black is in some trouble. Probably what Fabi was worried about was bishop to f5, rook a7, and rook b8, where you'll notice there's a ton of pressure on both the b and the c files here in this position, and it doesn't look easy for white to play. However, here white can play rook to a8, offering the trade of the rooks. And after rook b4 takes in this position, white has a very nice maneuver, knight to e1, guarding this pawn, and black is unable to take the pawn on b2 because here there would be rook to a8, and now black will lose one of these two pieces on the back rank. Fabi instead plays knight to d2. We get the move rook c7, rook to a1, and here Magnus plays the move rook to b8, trying to put big pressure on the queenside pawns. Now, when Magnus plays rook to b8, white is still better here, but this is already very, very difficult to play. And I don't want to say that Magnus knows everything or how to get these positions, but it's a position where it's not obvious why white is better, and you're going to have to burn a lot of time if you're trying to be precise. So, for example, the correct computer line is rook to a2, and after bishop to f5 here with these same issues of pressure on the b and c files, you can play bishop a7, rook b7, and you can calmly ignore everything by dropping back, because if black were to take on c2, you have rook to a8 once again, or not rook to a8, sorry, I was going to say rook to 8. Apparently you have rook to c6, and then you have rook to a8, and white is actually better here. In a blitz game where you can't spend a lot of time to think, and without knowing that there's something, you definitely won't spend 10 or 15 seconds. This is, in my view, simply inhuman and not something that you're going to find in a game. If this were a classical game, of course, I think all these moves could be found. Therefore, Fabi plays the move knight to b3. After we get the move knight to b3, Magnus plays bishop to f5, and as you can tell, now Fabi has a huge problem with these knights. Both these pawns now are going to become big targets here, and it's difficult to play. So Fabi goes knight to a5. Magnus takes the juicer, we get knight to c6, and here Magnus surprisingly makes an error with the move bishop g5. Now, Magnus being the great endgame player that he is, you would expect him to put the bishop either on f6 or on the h4 square, but ultimately he decides to go to g5. After bishop to g5, we get the trade of the bishops, and here Fabi plays the move rook takes a7. Now, the reason that white is completely fine in this position is that even though black is about to win a pawn, this knight is bashing on c6, the other knight is jumping into the action, and black, if anything, probably has to be a little bit careful. So here we get rook takes c2 from Magnus. Fabi plays knight b5, attacking the rook, and here Magnus Carlsen plays the move bishop to d3, blundering the rook on c7. He makes a face and he walks away from the board as soon as this happens. He loses another game, a second big shocker after the Arjun loss earlier, and this means that Magnus will not be in the lead after the first day. Now, what Magnus should have played here was he should have traded the rooks on a7, and after takes and bishop d3, black is actually better here. Frankly, I think Magnus would have had great chances to win. Probably knight c7 would have been played. Magnus can go knight f6 here. Now the pawn on d5 is weak, the knight is weak. Black is simply up a pawn here, and I would say with near certainty Magnus would have won this game. But Magnus fails to see the board correctly. He plays bishop d3, he hangs the rook, and Magnus has to resign immediately, and this means that Fabiano is in the lead. So after this big shocking loss for Magnus Carlsen, this means that headed into the second and final day, we have a big fight ahead of us. Now, I realize that I did not mention the format already yet, but the format is there are 19 rounds of blitz, and the top 8 players will play in a knockout. So fortunately for Magnus, even though he hasn't played his best, all he needs to do is make it into the top 8. So after day number 1 and the 13 rounds are completed, there is a 3-way tie for first place between Arjun Erigaisi, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and Fabiano Caruana. There are a couple players a half point behind on 9.5, and then of course there's Magnus Carlsen on 9 points. So we have a big second day ahead of us tomorrow. We'll see what happens, but definitely some big shockers on day number 1 of this blitz event. But it'll be really, really exciting to cover this tomorrow, and we'll see what happens and whether Magnus will be able to get his 20th World Championship title. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from day number 1 of the World Blitz Championship being held in Doha, Qatar. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back tomorrow with a recap after the completion of this Swiss portion and then the eventual knockout. So I hope you guys are looking forward to it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you very soon for our final recap from this great event. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.